Every year we hear the same thing. The new Galaxy has an even better camera. But how big are those improvements really? To find out, I took the last 6 generations of Galaxy phones, the S21 Ultra, S22 Ultra, the S23 Ultra, S24 Ultra, S25 Ultra, and the new S26 Ultra, packed them in my camera bag, and went out to shoot hundreds of photos. Let's see how Samsung's cameras have evolved over the years. But even before we even start, I want to show you something I noticed while getting ready for this video. Take a look at the screens on these Ultras. The older ones clearly show scratches from everyday use, totally normal after a few years. But then you get to the S24 Ultra and suddenly those scratches almost disappear. And the S25 Ultra, even after months of use, or more than a year, it still looks almost brand new. That new scratch-resistant glass is no joke, and the S26 Ultra should be just as good, maybe even better. Alright, let's start with the front camera. This year, the S26 Ultra finally gets a wider field of view, and this makes a big difference for group shots, as you can see more of your background. The colors have also changed a bit. The S21 Ultra has these yellowy tones and lots of noise. Just look at the jacket here, while the S22 Ultra is way more realistic with lots more detail. The S23 Ultra goes for extreme sharpening. I think it's a step back, honestly. But then the next 3 generations are better and more realistic. On the second photo, you can see again how colors have changed with generations. The S22 Ultra looks much better. The S23 Ultra is just too sharp. The S24 Ultra looks weirdly lifeless with desaturated colors. The S25 goes to the other extreme with saturation, and the S26 Ultra finally strikes a great middle ground, and the wide front lens is really nice to have. And in low light, we see these same swings between generations. The S26 Ultra strikes the best balance in my view. Alright, next up, let's jump to the star of the show, the main camera. Starting with this photo of the park and the sundial, the S21 Ultra has those slightly washed out colors. The S22 fixes that and still has lots of contrast and deep blacks. The S23 Ultra is a big change with yellowy tint and a very artificial look to it. The S24 Ultra is back to normal with realistic colors and less sharpening. The S25 drops the exposure. And finally, the S26 balances the exposure, but also goes for these quite saturated colors. And you can see a similar pattern of this picture with the house, the washed out S21, the more balanced S22, the extremely saturated look of the S23, the S24 that goes back to realism, the S25 that softens the shadows, and the S26 that goes for saturated warm colors. And here's one more. The S21 is again washed out, the S22 is not much better, the S23 adds saturation and warmth, the S24 looks better in my opinion with realistic colors, the S25 goes for a darker exposure, and the S26 swings back to a brighter, warmer photo, but the building loses its natural color. And you can see this progression in colors very clearly in this beach photo as well. Here's a good moment to mention camera specs. Now, I shot all the phones with the maximum quality option, and I also have Scene Optimizer turned on for all devices. The last 2 generations of Galaxies don't have it on by default, but for consistency's sake, I turned it on for all of the phones. Take a look here. We start with this very cold photo, jump to something more balanced with the S22. The S23 adds that extreme saturation. The S24 has captured a weird shot with blown out highlights here. The S25 finds a good balance, and the S26 just gets too bright and again has some problems with blown out highlights. We can clearly see Samsung trying to find that perfect color balance, changing something every year. The S26 Ultra fixes the problem with the darker exposure on the S25 Ultra, but you still get a very typical, warm, saturated photo with a smartphone look. There's a huge difference in colors when you compare the S26 Ultra to something like the Vivo X300 Pro, for example, which has very natural tones, much like a real camera, and that's something I really miss here. Next up, night photos. The S26 Ultra jumps to a faster aperture, which definitely helps. The S21 Ultra catches lots of flare and looks quite noisy. The S22 is a big step up. The S23 Ultra adds that extra saturation kick, and then the S24 Ultra just looks crazy. Samsung clearly just boosted the exposure to make the image look quote-unquote brighter, but in the process, the sky does not look dark like in reality, and there is all sorts of weird artifacts. Thankfully, the S25 Ultra dials colors back to normal, and the S26 Ultra once again allows the night to look like, well, a night. One other thing I noticed is that the S26 doesn't make you wait. It almost always snaps photos instantly at night, which is great. Take a look at this next picture. It just shows the change in color science so clearly. The S21 is dark, noisy, but kind of realistic. And the S22 is not as dark with a warmer look. The S23 allows for darker shadows, which is interesting. The S24 Ultra here again brings back the shadows, but looks a bit washed out. The S25 once again goes to a more contrasty look, and the S26 has captured the least dark photo of them all. In this next shot, we see a similar progression. Really, the S24 Ultra is the only one that looks downright bad in these photos, and the S26 Ultra finds a really good balance. Now, in the photo of the entrance to the bar, the S26 looks a bit flat, if you ask me. It just lifts up those shadows way too much, and I miss a bit of contrast here. This super dark photo was very interesting. You see a lot of noise on the S21 Ultra. The S22 cleans that up significantly, and the wider field of view is noticeable here. The S23 looks really strange. Notice these weird shadows around the umbrella on the left. The S24 is a big step up in my view. It has more natural detail. The S25 looks a bit strange with weird colors. And finally, the S26 shows how it can capture more light than the others here. Alright, next up, let's zoom in. Samsung was among the first companies using 100 times space zoom branding on the S21 Ultra, and while that sounded really cool at first, 100 times zoom remains more or less a complete gimmick to this day. Now, I was hoping to see some improvement over all those years, but honestly, I'm not seeing much. In fact, in this second photo of the Spire, the S24 Ultra, which apparently uses the least AI, looks best in my view. I also brought the Vivo X300 Pro along for the shoot, and just look at the quality on that camera. It also uses AI, but it has a more advanced sensor, and it just looks multiple levels better than the S26 Ultra. Alright, back to our comparison. Detail starts falling apart quickly after 30 times zoom, and here's a comparison of how this extreme zoom level has evolved in the past few years. So again, the change is basically just not there. 30x photos still look quite bad. Samsung was also using a 10x telephoto camera on the S21, 22 and 23 Ultra, but dropped it in favor of 5x camera and has stuck with this one since the S24 Ultra. It's interesting to see that here you notice how the 10x camera on the S23 Ultra captures much more detail, beating the processing of the newer Ultra. But still, I overall think that dropping the 10x camera for 5x was a good choice. When you compare 10x photos throughout the years, you see that even after the switch to a 5x camera, 10x images still look almost unchanged thanks to the high-resolution 50 megapixel camera that can punch in with sensor crop. And 5x is something you'll use way more often. Here you can clearly see the big improvement after the S24 series. The S26 Ultra further refines that with a faster aperture, and 5x photos now have less noise and generally look better. But one thing that hasn't changed all these years is the 3x zoom camera. And honestly, that's just a bit sad. 3 times zoom for me is a way more versatile shooting distance than 5x. I almost always prefer the look of 3x portraits, and you don't have to walk 2 blocks away just to fit someone in the frame. Sadly, the 3x camera is still way worse than 5x. It has a much smaller sensor, and you can see the level of detail is worse too. Alright, next up and finally the ultra-wide lens. Samsung gave it a big overhaul last year with the S25 Ultra, which finally jumped from a 12 megapixel sensor to a 50 megapixel one. It allows for pixel binning and better low light performance. But honestly, that has not translated into a night and day difference in actual photos, but a rather subtle improvement. During the day, the S26 Ultra is more similar to the S23 Ultra, as both go for more saturated, punchy colors, while the S25 and S24 prefer slightly darker exposure. I'm not a fan of the washed out grayish highlights on the S26. They look a bit artificial, and Samsung only leans into that cliche of smartphone looks for photos with saturated tones. One really cool thing I noticed while using the S26 Ultra is just how fast it captures night shots though. There's no countdown timer, it's just a snap and it's ready. Nice. Now as for ultra wide photos at night, the new Ultra gets extra bright. This can sometimes look a bit unnatural, as in this first photo of the sundial, but at other times it looks fine. The white balance in this next photo with the umbrellas is just way too warm, while previous Galaxies do a better job. And in this final photo, we again see the preference to get as much light as possible, not the most natural look, I would say. In conclusion, the S26 Ultra is a change, but if you ask me, it is not the change. Samsung is moving just way too slowly. We see very little progress with the color science for once. While other brands like Vivo and Xiaomi now give you an option for realistic photos, Samsung only gives you its own enhanced, more saturated version of reality. With larger sensors, those Chinese flagships are particularly far ahead on the zoom front, thanks to newer hardware and again, those larger sensors. So we can see the evolution this year. But what's coming next for the Galaxy? The S27 Ultra is already teased to finally improve not only the battery size, but also jump to a larger main camera to match rivals from China. Oppo, Vivo and Xiaomi all use 1-inch sensors. I expect Samsung to finally adopt a more capable zoom camera too. Right now the S26 Ultra camera still feels great and capable, it's just not the most exciting one out there.